Well, good morning, everyone. If you're on Zoom and you can hear me all right, give me a thumbs up just so I know. Great. And welcome into the space. A reminder to everybody in the space that today we move to mask optional, with the exception of when we're singing in worship. We ask you please to put on a mask while we sing. So that should be fun to watch. Let me open us with a word of prayer. In life and in death, we are with you, O God. And we ask that you would be present with us this day so that the conversations that we have and the work that we do here might increase the likelihood that we can die in peace when it is our time, and that we can help others do the same. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So good morning, everyone. From listening to you all, I think that I have heard that for many of us, the fear that many of us hold around death may not be death itself, but rather the process leading up to it. Including things like not being able to say goodbye, including things like pain, including things like dementia and fears of not being present to the world as we're present to it in this moment, and including unending medical treatments and procedures, a medicalized ending that prevents us from dying in peace. Remember those statistics that Gretchen shared in the very first session. And that is that 80% of people say they want to die at home, and yet 20% actually do. 60% die in an acute care hospital or nursing home. Why is it that our hopes and intentions are so far off from what actually happens? Well, today we're going to start by giving some answers to those questions from some experts, including medical experts who have studied the medicalization of death and the biases that are still present in medicine. I know we have a lot of medical people around, so I'm really nervous. And I want to say that our goal today is not to point fingers at the medical establishment. We do, after all, have medicine to thank for our incredible life expectancies. Remember Matt Taylor's statistics when he was teaching his class about the biblical world in the time of Jesus, where the life expectancy was somewhere between 20 and 30 years of age. We are thankful for medical advances that have given so many of us a longer and healthier life. Our perspective here is to identify how the natural process of dying shifted from the locus of the home to the managed space of the hospital, and the consequences of that shift. We're going to point out some potential flaws in the system so that you can be aware of them and have a better chance of maintaining agency in the process of your own dying or attending to that process with those you love. And I'm going to give you 3 pastoral pieces of advice that I have gleaned from 20 years now of being with families and individuals in the process of dying. Pieces of advice that I hope will give you or your loved one a better chance of living well and dying well, which is what this class is all about. But first, we want to ask you again to get with someone that you don't know that well this morning. Or if you're on Zoom, just be prepared to be randomly sorted and share the following. Let's see if I can shift my, perfect. Technology is working here. I think it has something to do with the fact that Rachel Cunningham is present in the space. Yes. All right, I will copy and paste these into the chat, but you can also remember them. And that is, we're asking you to share a story of a time when you or a loved one had a significant hospitalization or experience with medicine. And I don't mean prescriptions, I mean the medical interface, the medical relationship, positive, negative, or somewhere in between. What worked well? What didn't work well or work at all? What did you learn in the process? And then finally, the third movement in these questions, how does this experience inform your own thoughts about how you hope to die well? Is that clear? Yes. So a story out of your own experience about a significant hospitalization or interaction with the medical arena, positive, negative, somewhere in between. What worked well, what didn't work well, what did you learn in the process, and how does that experience inform your own thoughts about how you hope to die well? So I'm going to cut and paste that as I have been instructed to do. I see Matt and Morgana on the same machine. Fear not. If you end up in a group of 3, that's fine too. And let's give everybody, what's been working well? 10 minutes? Is that sufficient? 10 minutes, and then we will come back together. So I hope that was helpful to you, because a lot of what I'm going to be doing today is sharing stories and things that I've learned from them. L.S. Dugdale, who is a medical doctor and author of the book, The Lost Art of Dying, quotes the bioethicist Albert Johnson in her search, I think it's she, right? In her search as a doctor to kind of understand more about why medicine has had such a difficult time dealing with death itself. And so she quotes the bioethicist Albert Johnson, who says, our moral response to the imminence of death demands that we rescue the doomed. We throw a rope to the drowning, rush into burning buildings to snatch the entrapped, dispatch teams to search for the snowbound. And this rescue mentality spills over into medical care. And so Johnson calls this obligation the rule of rescue. Dr. Dugdale says that as a rescuer, doctors often feel duty-bound to save the patient. Not only this, but doctors love to be rescuers. Heroes who descend from on high, she writes, to fight evil disease and liberate patients in distress. It is part of our common mythology. That is so creepy. I found that on the internet. You see that photo? It's white Jesus in the operating room. With his hand on the shoulder, on the surgeon. I mean, no offense to Jesus, but I really don't want any hands on the surgeon. My surgery. It's part of our common mythology. So she goes on to say that patients conspire with this mentality. When life itself is at stake, she writes, patients rarely want doctors who take the cost-effective, risk-balancing, rational approach. We want a doctor savior who will stop at nothing. The physician's compulsion to rescue fuels the patient's burning desire to be rescued, which again stokes the doctor's rescue fantasy. The problem, of course, is that there is no rescue from death. Now, I want to pause here and acknowledge that there are lots of readings about how to change the medical system to perform better as patients move out of treatment to fight an illness or manage a disease and toward the inevitability of death. And in fact, a lot of these systems have changed for the better in the past couple of decades. I think the expansion of the hospice movement itself is a big case in point. Some of us, I believe it was last summer, read, I can never say his name correctly, Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal. And another good book is Knocking on Heaven's Door. Those are two that if you want to go deeper into these questions around systems and systems change, Gretchen and I would both recommend those. But today we're really going to focus on living the medical realities, living in those realities where we find ourselves. Not so much about changing the systems, but living in the ones that we actually encounter, and hopefully that you all were just talking about in your groups. So that brings me to my first pastoral piece of advice, which is for everyone to learn to get comfortable about talking about death, about actually bringing it up. And I think a patient is actually in the best position to initiate that conversation. One of the unfortunate side effects of the rise of hospitals that has been noted is that as death and sickness move from the purview of the family and the home, where people had no other choice but to deal with it and to pass along wisdom with others about how to care for people who are dying, death itself was whisked away from family view. Dr. Dugdale says that death came to replace sex as the ultimate unmentionable. And that has certainly been my experience in many, many situations. I remember one time I was visiting a parishioner who had received a terminal diagnosis, and we were with each other, and I started praying, and I think my prayer was something like, God, bring your peace so that as so-and-so takes this next step toward the mystery of death. And she interrupted me in the prayer and said, I'm not dying. And I think she was like in her late 90s. Another time, and this is less humorous, I witnessed a father dying of colon cancer, and no one ever spoke the words about death. He literally died with no one ever having acknowledged that this was happening. Now, think about how difficult it is for a doctor to discuss death if a family is conspiring with the system in that kind of silence. So learn to talk about death with your loved ones. Bring it out of that category of unmentionable. Get comfortable with just saying the word like Voldemort. Talking about your final wishes so that when the medical supports need to make that shift from rescue to comfort, then those medical supports are able to shift with you. One of the reasons that I love hospice care so much, I know Gretchen does too, is that the teams who staff hospice care, they have learned how to have these conversations. And you can ease those conversations yourself by learning to have them with yourself. So my second piece of pastoral advice is plan your own death and help your loved ones do the same. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, actually spend some time, and we've talked about this already, writing down your wishes. How would you like to die? And then share that with the people that you're closest with. Now, there are some kind of logistical things that you can do with this. Everybody, I believe, my opinion, should have an advanced directive. And in fact, I think a lot of primary care physicians now include that as a part of their routine conversations with people when you go and see some heads shaking yes in the space. There are two major pieces that are a part of an advanced directive. There is a living will giving guidance to family and medical teams as to your wishes around and when, how to give or withdraw life-sustaining support. And also a medical power of attorney to give a loved one or family member the power to make medical decisions on your behalf when you are not able to do it yourself. You can download these forms from the state of Maryland. We have already included the links.
On this sheet, it has all the books and some other resources. And I think it's available on this weekend.
Right, so we share every week on our email to the congregation, kind of an update on the class. And there is a link to resources. And within those resources, there are links to the things that I'm going to discuss today. So if you have trouble finding that or whatever, feel free to reach out to me or Gretchen. We'll make sure that you have it. You can download these forms with instructions from the state of Maryland. And I think in addition to those two things that I mentioned, the Maryland form also includes sort of your wishes post-death for your body, what to do with your body and things like that. There are options there as well. But here's the pastoral piece of advice that I really want to emphasize over and against just filling out this form. And that is that recent studies have shown, or verified rather, that these documents are actually less important than the conversations that happen as a result of those documents. Why? Well, that's because we can't plan for every situation, right? So planning your death does not mean that your death is going to go as you plan it. Part of planning your death means talking to others about your wishes so that your community of loved ones is so well informed that they feel confident and comfortable to the best of their ability, making decisions that they know that you would want if you were able to make those decisions. Medical events often play out differently than what we expect. So as I said, the research has shown, there was an article in the New York Times actually a couple of weeks ago that discussed this, that the conversations that you have with loved ones are the critical thing. If you have a significant other, take them out to dinner and have a lovely chat about how you'd like to die and how you'd not like to die if it's up to you.
What's for dessert?
What's for dessert? That's your choice, David. If you have children or friends, initiate the conversation well before you are sick. And these conversations, you do not have to limit to the very narrow questions on the advanced directive forms. One resource that Gretchen highlighted for me is from a nonprofit, agingwithdignity.org. And they offer conversation resources in the form of 5 wishes. For a small fee on their site, you can actually get all the details. And it is a nonprofit. But I think even if you don't do that, these are sort of the 5 different wish areas that they organize. Wish number 1, the person I want to make care decisions for me when I can't. Wish number 2, the kind of medical treatment I want or don't want. Wish 3, how comfortable I want to be. Wish 4, how I want other people to treat me. Wish 5, what I want my loved ones to know. So you can follow those headings kind of out on your own. I'm not peddling their resource, but it is, I do like their categories. Again, to credit Gretchen, she's also made me aware of the MOLST documents, which stand for Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. And those are more extensive directives that you fill out with the assistance of a physician, and the physician actually signs off on those. You can also look into that, which might be a better option for some, especially those who do not want things like CPR or other traumatic interventions beyond a certain age or certain diagnoses. I have personally performed CPR on a number of people as a former firefighter. And I think your average layperson doesn't realize that the force involved in that procedure is pretty brutal, right? And I think most of us watch television shows and do CPR on someone and they pop up and are like, thank you for doing CPR on me. And I just want to reinforce that we are the ones who get to decide what level of intervention we want or do not want as we get older and move toward age where death is more likely than not. And it's important that you think through, again, your own wishes and help your family members to do the same. Otherwise, the medical system, for very good reasons, plays things out in a particular way. You can have more agency if you choose to exercise it. All right, so here's my 3rd piece of pastoral advice. And that is to recruit a family member to be your advocate when you have major surgery or hospitalization. And if you want, learn to be that kind of an advocate yourself. When my brother was diagnosed with a very serious form of cancer, he asked his wife and he asked me to be the two primary people who were in the hospital with him the 2 days after his recovery, which I know from experience of visiting people is often the diciest of times. Usually right after surgery, people are feeling pretty good because they're so on anesthesia that as they come out of it, day 2 and 3 are rough. And that's when I was there with my brother. And I remember overnight, so this is like 3, 4 in the morning, just he had intolerable pain, and which is very difficult to see your loved one with that kind of pain. And I remember, the nurse response at first was, "I'm sorry, we've given everything that the doctors say we can give." And you watch your loved one in pain for another while longer. And then you get up and you go to the nurse's station. You say, "I know what you just told me, but this isn't acceptable. We need to come up with a different plan." And then you get the nurse manager in the room to discuss it. And eventually you have to get to the doctor who says, "Yeah, actually, we have these other 2 or 3 options." But sometimes it takes that kind of advocacy to be able to really attend to the health and well-being of someone in a hospital environment. My experience with a lot of people in my parents' age group, which is that kind of boomers age, is that they defer to doctors as experts on everything, which I think is why my brother asked me to be in the hospital and not one of my parents. And I think they don't realize that doctors actually need to know what's going on from the patient or from the person who knows the patient so well that they're able to help distinguish when do we need another intervention or when do we not. And while I think some doctors are better than others about getting this information, my experience is that most people can be more assertive on the patient side about communicating that. Yes, Laura.
I just want to add in that hospital physicians change over days.
Yes.
So you get a new one every couple of days. So
right. Laura just add in the space that physicians also change, especially if you're over a weekend or something like that, hospitalists. And there are others who understand the business side of this and, why doctors are moved in, and even like from different areas of the state, who don't live in that area. So you may have a doctor that you see for 2 days and then never again. So you are the connecting link as an advocate. Now, David, yes.
I was just going to say, my dad was in the hospital for 14 months, in and out between rehab and back and forth. And I would always call ahead and say, "Who's a doctor on call for my dad?" I said, "I want to meet him. I'm going to be there at 4 o'clock. So I would meet with him. And it was funny because after a while, as soon as I hit the floor, the nurses said, "He's here." And they would all go in my dad's room and make sure he was being taken care of. And because it was a nightmare taking care of him because he had an open.
I should have done this. Tell your story again.
Yeah, my dad had bladder cancer after my mom died. And so he had a colostomy bag put in after they took the cancer out. And his wound would never close. So he was in and out of the hospital, between hospital and rehab hospital, for 13 months straight. And I went every day. And I would always call ahead and ask who's the doctor on call that day for my father, and said I want to talk to him to find out what's going on with his open wound. And especially at the nursing home where there was a rehab, meeting with somebody there was important because they would let the wound not get cleaned. And the first thing I would do is check that wound. And as soon as I walked in the building, they were like, everybody would scatter because they knew I was coming down the hallway, because I did not let anything go by without him being taken care of, because 13 months in the hospital straight is horrible.
Great. Thank you, David. So if you're a person like my parents, you get very worried about offending doctors. And my response to that is several. First, if a doctor gets offended by a patient or their loved one, advocating for their own wishes, including adequate pain relief, then try to get another doctor. Second, I think most doctors in hospitals have limited time to engage with their patients. So they come to your room, they read your chart outside of it, they talk with you or the loved one for maybe 15 minutes. So the more that you can communicate what's actually happening that you have seen for the last 6 hours, then the more that helps them. And finally, I would say good hospitals, good medical care encourages healthcare advocates. I actually did a web search, and the first thing that came up on this was Johns Hopkins Hospital, which actually recommends that every patient have an advocate. And they have resources about that, and we will include that in the links as well. So I think this is especially needed in this moment as we encounter some caregiver shortages. So again, this isn't about maligning like doctors and staff. In fact, my advice to you would be to treat nurses with lots of love and respect, because they are way overworked. They're also in many cases dealing with shortages. So it's very much about respect, but also understanding that right now we're in an even more dicey situation because of all the COVID impacts on people and their employment and so forth. So when it comes to terminal illnesses and approaching death, here's the way I've seen advocates really help. And I'm not sure if I do a slide for this. Oh, that's the Johns Hopkins little website, The Power of a Health Advocate. Yeah, okay, I didn't do a slide for this. One is go with your loved ones to doctor's appointments and ask important questions. When I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, I remember, I'll never forget it. I was in my doctor's office, just a routine physical. And he said to me, he's, examining my neck, and he said, "I think you might have a tumor in your neck." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah. And I said, tumor? Do you mean like cancer?" And he said, "Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. It's possible as thyroid cancer." I literally got like weak and faint and needed to lie down on the table because I was so shocked, and I have no idea what happened the rest of the visit. And I think a lot of patients have that experience. Now, in that situation, obviously I couldn't plan for it, but if you're going with a loved one to an oncology visit, for example, where you're going to have to make decisions about, should I do chemo? Should I not do chemo? Is this worth it? How much pain am I going to experience? How's this going to impact my quality of life or not? Bring your advocate with you. They can sit there, take notes, ask questions. You can talk about them beforehand, and then they can make sure all those questions get asked when your fear or anxiety shuts down your frontal cortex.
And they can remember the answers.
And they can remember the answers, yeah. They can help with understanding your pain thresholds. Basically, I think people that you've been with for a while can see, like, when is this pain that this person's sort of good at handling? And when is this like, whoa, this is off the charts. I haven't seen this level. This person seems to be overwhelmed. They can call in reinforcements when needed. And we've already David kind of alluded to that, calling in the head nurse on the floor. I always forget they have different lingo for charge nurse and head nurse and stuff, but I just say, can I speak to someone farther up the chain? An attending physician, a person who is responsible for making sure that the care delivered by other doctors is to the right threshold. And if you need to, patient advocates, which most hospitals now have. They may require them, I'm not sure. But if you are really not satisfied with the care you're getting, you can really go up the chain and say, I want to talk to someone in the patient advocacy part of this hospital, and they will send someone, because hospitals don't want to get sued, right? They really want to deal with these things before they get to that level. Just one story about this. One time I was visiting a family in our church, and the parent had just received a terminal diagnosis. And not 30 minutes later, a medical salesperson for an experimental treatment entered their room. I don't remember which hospital. I'm glad I don't remember, but they entered the room, and this person, now their family is just absorbing this news. What does this mean? How we process our emotions in the midst of this. And 30 minutes later, the salesperson comes in and wants to basically pitch this experimental treatment that involved, it sounded to me, a very invasive heart procedure, and involved like drilling through the bottom of the heart and inserting a pump that they would wear around their, and the family looked overwhelmed. I rarely do this as a minister because I don't think it's my business, but I just stopped the person and said, this family has just received very difficult news. Could you come back tomorrow? And the person was like, oh, sure, yeah. But that's what I mean by advocacy in an environment where you need to help people deal with things as they can deal with them. And remember that you have agency within that space to be able to assert what is helpful to you and what is not. I've often thought that hospitals from a patient side are a lot like prisons. If you think about it, you come into this space, they take your clothes and give you terrible uniforms. They put you on their schedule for eating, on the things that they want to give you to eat. You have a little more choice now, but not a lot. Someone comes in whenever they want, interrupts your sleep. The lights come on. It's a terribly disruptive environment. And I think over time, people sort of adjust to that by even giving up more of their agency, because you're so used to it being taken from you that you forget that you can say things like, could you come back later? Because I'm not ready to absorb that information or consider another variable at this point. I want to end with, and then we'll have time for questions. I want to end with a good story, and that is the death of the mother of one of our families, where the family was able to get, and this is in a hospital, because I don't want people to leave with the idea that if you or your loved one ends up in a hospital, it's going to be a bad death, right? The family was able to gather around the bedside of their mother, wife, friend, stroking her hair, massaging her feet, sharing stories with one another about what she means to them, stories from their lives that have shaped who they are. They were able to play her favorite music in the background, which to me always makes that space feel so much less antiseptic, so much less institutional. They offered words of gratitude for life given, laughing lovingly at foibles. They treated her as if she was fully present, which is another thing that hospice care providers teach, and which I would recommend too, is treating people as if they are fully present. Morphine was available and administered regularly to keep her totally comfortable. And they literally walked her to death's door until her last breath. So I have seen good deaths in hospitals, in hospice, and at home. I've also seen difficult deaths in hospitals and at home, not so much in hospice. And I think that the more that we can initiate these conversations with one another, make plans and communicate those to others, and be a part of our own care, the better chance we can have at having a good death and helping others have the same. So I am going to stop here, and I am going to see if I can get this off the screen. There we go. I'm getting better at this, Rachel. All right.
Drag that window down. Yeah.
All right. So we can see everybody on Zoom. And what comments, questions, stories? I'm going to hand the mic to Andy Imperato, who, if you didn't see, is here from California.
Hey, Andy.
Hey, it's great to be back. Not surprising, I'm going to bring up disability as part of this topic, because I feel like part of the reason people are afraid of death is they're afraid of disability. So I think if you look, and in many cases, they're more afraid of disability than they are of death. But if you look at your advanced directive questions, I think a lot of those questions are asking, how do you feel about having a long-term disability and not having the level of functioning that you have now? And we carry around a lot of ableism. We get a lot of messages from doctors and others about whether life is worth living with a certain level of disability or impairment. So as you think about those questions, I encourage you to also have some humility. You don't know how you're going to feel about living with a certain impairment until you're in it. And doctors tend to assume that your quality of life is much worse with that impairment than you experience it. So that's my only qualifier, is just think about ableism when you think about how you might answer those questions.
That's great, Andy. And next week,
we'll talk about the spiritual tasks of aging towards death, and that will certainly be part of it.
Which I think is going to include a lot of discussion about taking on disability, new disabilities for us. So your point is really well taken, especially in relationship. One of the things that we had sort of talked about maybe discussing, and I decided not to, was about this question of what are they calling it now? Medical assisted suicide, and which I'm not a real fan of. It's often pitched as around agency, but I wonder if you have a perspective on that in particular, because I know that that's a kind of a hot topic from disability rights advocates as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. I think in the HIV/AIDS community, there's a lot of support for, I think they call it medical aid in dying. It's the politically correct term. People who don't like it tend to call it physician-assisted suicide or just assisted suicide. I think for a lot of folks with disabilities, again, the fear is about ableism and about capitalism. And there's things that lead people to not want to be a burden on their family. And part of what they don't want to be a burden is a financial burden. So one way to think about it is, what set of policies could we have so that people really have a neutral choice? And right now we don't have those policies.
Right.
So it's a fear that ableism coupled with that tool can lead to people feeling like they have to end their lives before they're ready.
Which gets to the overall, how are we valued? How does our society value us? And I think your point about capitalism and production, we're often valued for what we can produce, which also I think is an important point.
I also just wanted to add,
introduce yourself.
I'm Gretchen. I just wanted to add that between routine hospitalization and medical care and hospice, there is palliative care, which is a really growing medical specialty and can be enormously helpful in helping people to look at those ableism and what feels right, what doesn't, sort out what makes your life meaningful, what makes your life valuable, and brings in a whole team of people to work. And they can work with a person for a long time. It doesn't have to be like you're within 6 months of dying. It can be sometimes years, to help people keep those questions of meaning in the forefront, and then help to make that happen. And learning how to live with a smaller range of physical or emotional or mental kind of abilities. So
with grace. And with grace. And with grace.
With grace, exactly, with grace.
And not easily achieved.
No, I mean, I think that's a challenge for us.
You got a heads up on the screen.
I just think that I worked with people 60 and older.
Can you
when I
help
was
me
in
with
my
the screen
20s.
to know who's?
And so, pardon?
Help me know
I'm
who's
Diane
got
Ross.
their hand.
And I thought, I learned at that time that, so at a very young age, that the challenge, my challenge would be to accept gradual limitations and disabilities, as Andy talked about, but to do that with grace. And I thought that was a really important challenge to try to meet.
Next week.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, it's great. You all are perfectly thinking ahead to next week. Now, I'm sorry we missed their hands up in Zoom. So I'm going to start with Julie, who's the top left on my screen.
Hi, everyone. Andrew, you're right on point today with what's going on in the hospitals and rehab and the advocacy is so important for family member. As we deal with my brother's illness, I have so many walls. But what I want to
Hey, Julie, you're breaking up. You're breaking up on Zoom. Try turning off your camera just for a moment and see if that improves the feed.
One of the things we have found, I'll write it because, let me just write it because it's continuing to echo.
You sound good now. You sound great.
Oh, thanks. What I was saying was that with my brother's illness and advocacy, it's so important that somebody be there. If not daily, at least every other day. It is really critically important because the staff is so short, they're so short-staffed that things are not happening. Also, more importantly, is taking notes when you're there, keeping track of what's happened and what's supposed to happen and doesn't happen. It's really, really important. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. Paige, I think you're next on my screen.
Yeah, just about that medical assistance in dying, I agree with Andy. We really need guidelines for it, not to say it's always inappropriate or always appropriate, because there are people who are sentenced to extreme pain in their own bodies. Like there's an article in the Sun today about a woman who was had chronic pain syndrome that was incurable, and every day was like a nightmare to her, and couldn't be really treated. She couldn't tolerate any medications for it either. And she enjoyed her life in other ways, but she couldn't tolerate the pain. And at 35, she decided she'd had enough. But the only way for her to get help with ending her horrible situation was to go to Switzerland, pay $12,000. Some group called Pegasus over there will help. You don't have to be at death's door in order to be assisted in dying. And I know the analogy's been made before to animals that, you know, when we see they're in extreme pain and we can't do anything about it, we help them have a peaceful death. But we're so reluctant to do that with ourselves. And actually, there's also a book out now about a man who had an Alzheimer's diagnosis, and he had decided he didn't want to become somebody different and die, you know, that kind of death. And he again had to go to Switzerland because he wasn't going to die within 6 months. So even our states that allow assistance in dying, you have to be at death's door to get it. So I really think we have a long way to go as a country to provide that kind of, I call it compassion, to the people who really need it.
Thank you, Paige. Al or Ellen?
I served as a volunteer and a board member for a hospice in Iowa for 8 years before moving to Maryland. And one of the things that struck me each month at our board meetings, when the head of the board would pass out a data sheet on the previous month, was that even though hospice could cover terminally ill patients for 6 months, the average stay between admission to hospice and death was around 10 days. So hospice has always seemed to me to be a remarkably underutilized kind of service. And my experience and my observation was that the reason for that, the responsibility for that, lay not nearly so much with the doctors as with the patients, but most especially with the patients' families, who simply were unwilling to let go and regarded it as admitting defeat to have their loved one committed to hospice. And that seemed very sad to me.
Thank you, Al. You broke up a little bit, but I think we got most of it. And I think essentially what you're saying is that even though hospice is covered for 6 months, the average stay is 10 days, meaning that people don't utilize it as early or as often as they could. And that your experience has been that's really families who are more reluctant to take advantage of that because of the, I guess, because of the association that people have with hospice as maybe it's throwing in the towel, so to speak, the acceptance of death at a certain point.
That's accurate. Thank you.
All right, and Julie made a comment in the chat, and I'm going to let Rachel read it.
She said that she wanted to point out that in third world countries, that family often go with the patient and camp out, and so that they're models for advocacy.
Respond to the last comment.
Just responding to the last comment about family members often being reluctant to take advantage of hospice because it was throwing in the towel. Not infrequently, it's the most or the least involved family members who have been more absent from the whole process over some years, who dig in their heels most vehemently, and you can't let Aunt Tilly die. And so having family conferences well in advance and saying specifically well in advance, these two know what I want. And those who haven't been around, I love you and I'm glad you're here, but they know what I want. and making sure that that's done, because often it's the least involved who really dig in their heels. It's been what I've noticed anyway.
Great. I think we are close to time. And our homework for next week, one is I hope that you've had a chance to start thinking about your own funeral. We talked about that last week. We'll be coming back to that at a certain point. That'll be 2 weeks from now. So keep working on that. Another is to take a look at an advanced directive if you don't already have one, and use that as a conversation starter. And then the third is, yes.
The Genesis and Gospel readings that I gave out very first 2 weeks ago, we will get to those probably also on the last day.
I'm just going to let you say that, actually.
Yeah. So 2 weeks from now, on the last day of the class, we'll also get to the Genesis and Gospel lessons that we handed out on the first Sunday. I've got copies.
No, I have a question.
Yeah. Okay.
So when it says Genesis chapter 47 verses 25 or 27 to 50, and what's the 26?
No.
To 50.
Chapter 20.
Chapter 50, verse 26.
Chapter 47.
It's 3 chapters.
3 chapters.
47, 27, that goes through 50.
Yeah. And the gospel lessons, don't be like it's a lot of reading, but really just zero in on those things on that reading of the last week of Jesus that pertain more or less to what triggers a thought about a way to die and what's important in dying. So those 2 things will be particularly in the last week.
That and the funeral.
Those 2 things, that and the funeral, will be in the last week. So you all are doing a beautiful job of pushing us ahead to topics that we definitely need and want to talk about. And Gretchen will be with you next week and leading this larger talk about the spiritual aspects of dying, which is going to include things like, I think, our ableist notions of what it means to have limited capacity and how some people diminish that kind of living before they've experienced it from the outside, and how we might better embrace loss as a part of our living and the new things we can discover about ourselves as a result. So I'm going to close us now with a word of prayer, and thanks everybody here and those of you in Zoom land for being with us today. Let us pray. Gracious God, thank you for your blessing of life, and thank you for your promise that your love continues with us in death. Help sustain us in these conversations and in this work, so that in living and in dying, we might give glory to you. In your name we pray, amen.